The Macabre World podcast is brought to you by Darker Art Studio, home of real human bone jewelry. Stock and custom pieces are available, so visit us on the web at www.darkerartstudio.com and show them your darker art side. Macabre World, a podcast from Darker Art Studio, where we explore the dark, strange, and unusual from this world and beyond. Hello, and thank you for joining the Macabre World podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Digati, and with me is Suzanne Munson, author, Jefferson scholar, and she is the the scribe of a book known as the Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. Thank you, Suzanne, for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about why this book is so unique?
Well, I'm the first person that I know of who has actually asked a medium to access Thomas Jefferson. And what he says is quite profound, and I encourage people to please read this. Please pay attention to it, because what he says is very important for today.
Now, your views on spiritual mediumship before the book, before this project, was this a reinforcement of something you had experiences with? What were your experiences like prior to the book?
Well, if you'd asked me 15 years ago about what I'd be doing today, I probably would have thought, I wouldn't be doing these crazy things, but they're actually not crazy. I think I've always been interested in the spiritual life, and the first time the near-death experience accounts started coming, you would see them on the Today Show every now and then. And sure. Eben Alexander's book was one of the big time sellers, and he was on the air quite a lot. And I'd pay a lot of attention to the near-death experience accounts, because they did describe, seem to give accuracy to the thought that we do have life after physical death. I think I got into this sort of thing in earnest after the death of my husband in 2013. I would go outdoors and I would look at the sky, and I was not getting anything from him. I was not getting any signs. I think I did have a visit one night in the middle of the night, just in a dream, but that was all. And I really wanted more communication, but I really didn't know how to go about it. 6 months later, I went to a writer's retreat in the mountains of Virginia, and those who had published books were encouraged to place their books around so that people could read them. So one of the writers had written a book called Friends in High Places, and it was about her career as a medium and as a ghostbuster. I thought that was really interesting. So I got on the porch and read that. And her name was Katie. And she was my sweet mate. And I said, well, Katie, do you think you're a medium, amateur medium? She didn't do it professionally. I said, could you connect with my late husband? So I gave her his name, but no other information. She'd never met him. So she went into her room with a yellow notepad and came back a half hour later and described him perfectly. Several months later, I went home and told my children about it. They didn't quite know what to think. They sort of halfway wanted to believe, but halfway thought it was crazy. And so then several months later, I went to a meeting of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, an organization formed by astronaut Edgar Mitchell after he returned from the moon and saw beautiful Earth, and had sort of an epiphany that there's much more to know than just a bunch of rocks, a bunch of planets floating around in space, and that Earth, of course, is much more than just a planet. It has a life of its own. And so he founded this organization. We have a lot of very interesting programs exploring out of the box kind of thinking.
Sure, yeah.
And so one of the speakers was Irene Kindig, and she had written a book about conversations with 7 of her departed family and friends. And the book had gone on to be to win international awards. And so she had worked with a medium whose name is Jana Anna. And I thought, well, if Jana was good enough for this project, maybe she's good enough for me to try to talk to my late husband. So I began with him, and she lives in Indiana, I live in Virginia. I schedule an appointment with her usually a week in advance. She calls me right on the dot. We have an hour. The session is recorded. I keep all the recordings, but I seldom go back to listen because I take really, really good notes. And I have a whole folder full of notes going back several years, and it's very helpful for me to review those notes. So then eventually I talked to my mother and father and some departed friends, and I felt that all of the responses were accurate, and that I was in effect hearing from these real individuals who were in another form, and a form of higher energy than the energy that we have here in physical form, but still alive and still with their own personalities, very much with their own personalities. So then the thought, so in the beginning of each session with this medium, she will give me a reading as to how I'm being seen from the other side, from my guides and others. And so sometimes they see me as too busy or, needing to take a break, different things. But in the fall of 2019, I think it was, I began to hear that I was being seen as a metaphysical historian.
I love that term. I think that's a wonderful term.
Well, I wrote that down because I'd never heard that term before. That term had never occurred to me. And I wrote it down on my yellow notepad and filed it away and didn't think much about it. And then that same reading came through a couple of months later. And I said, well, maybe there's something to this, maybe I should be accessing somebody important. So I said, well, if I'm accessing regular people, why not somebody famous? And I'd already written a book about Thomas Jefferson and his mentor, George Wythe. It was a biography of George Wythe called Jefferson's Godfather. And I had researched Jefferson's early life, the time that he needed the mentoring. And so I said, well, what the heck? And by then COVID had hit. It was March. And so I had 8 or 9 sessions between March and August of 2020. And Jana and I would set an hour to talk. I would put my phone on speaker, and then I would type furiously on my laptop as I asked the questions. And I thought to strengthen the book that I wouldn't just ask my own questions. And so I went on Amazon and I saw the books, more recent books, biographies that have been written about Thomas Jefferson. And I found 8 or 10 Jefferson scholars who were still alive, whose emails I could access. And so I presented in my email to them the idea of a class project. Of course, I'd never tell them what I was really up to. But
do you think that would have given them a little more pause than they needed at that point?
Oh, they would not have participated. No, they're all materialists, pretty much, as far as I know. And so 8 men replied to me very kindly, and some gave several questions, some gave just one or two. So I had all those in addition to my own questions ready to go for Mr. Jefferson. And we would tackle different subjects. My first questions were about government because I write about government.
Sure.
That's why I write my books. They're nonfiction books, history books about our founding fathers, and good government is extremely important to me.
I agree. I think it should be important to all of us. When it was a pleasure to read the book, and I highly recommend it. The book is called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson by Suzanne Munson. I got it from Amazon, and there's lots of ways to go out there and read it. And it's really, I think it's important, and it was beautifully stated in the introduction to your book, that whether or not someone may be of the mindset to fully back the idea of spiritual mediumship and everything. It's a great read, whether you're going to take that leap of faith or not. I think that the information in it is incredibly reflective and certainly very, very germane to the activities of government today. And I think it's so, whether it's for folks out there that there's a lot of listeners that are very much into the spiritual side of things, but even if you're not, I think you should read the book. I really do. And one of the things I thought was very interesting is when you mentioned metaphysical historian. And I love this term. I learned it first from you. And I absolutely love the term, because I think this is, as you had stated in our earlier conversation before we were live, this is a whole new genre. It truly is. And I loved that you compared this era to the era of Galileo.
Yes. We hear all the time that we're entering in an age of enlightenment, and people are going to be accepting things that they would not have accepted 50 years ago.
Oh,
certainly
we need
I
that.
am.
We really need that.
Yes, I'm accepting things that I wouldn't have believed 30 years ago, simply because I'm exploring a lot of, scientific research. It's not just kooky people who are in this age of enlightenment. Some very brave medical doctors and psychiatrists have, first of all, explored the near-death experience, which does indicate clearly to me that there is life after physical death.
I think Raymond Moody comes to mind.
Raymond Moody was
absolutely
the first pioneer,
very much so,
up at the University of Virginia. And so once you accept the premise that we survive physical death, well, what do? Do we sit on a pink cloud playing the harp? That's really boring. So then I explored, what we do between lives, and I explored reincarnation and a lot of those things. You don't have to believe in reincarnation to, read my book. That's not certainly in there much. But anyway, just people need to keep an open mind about things. There's a lot that we were not taught in the Western world that other cultures have known for thousands of years. We're slow in this regard.
I agree. And I think I love the premise of, well, if you could ask him, Thomas Jefferson, anything, what would you ask? And your book is full of all kinds of answers. Not to give too much of it away, but I think one of the things that I thought was very, very interesting was that when speaking of writing the Declaration of Independence, I'm 35 minutes from Philadelphia, where it was written. And I've read the document, and for historical and educational purposes, that he was writing, in his words, from divine providence, that he bypassed his mind, that it very much sounded like a medium himself, that he was channeling something, that he was, very similar to the practice the mediums use of automatic writing. And that the inspiration, because if you, outside of the legal contents, it's beautifully written. Yes, it is very lofty and very profound language.
Yes. He encourages people to please go back and read the founding documents, not just, of course, the Constitution. We should all go back and read that. But the Declaration of Independence is way more than just our divorce papers from England. They're very lofty ideals there. I don't know whether Jefferson in his lifetime felt strongly that he was being divinely inspired, but he does feel that way now from his place in spirit, that he and the founding fathers were special people at a special time to make a huge difference in the history of humankind, to bring freedom and democracy to people on a large scale for the first time ever.
It's an inspirational thought. And I thought further, and there is obviously a lot more detail, but that this is revolution and change are ongoing.
Yes.
That the divine forces, it's almost an inevitability of change, I believe is the way it was stated.
Well, he called for a revolution every now and then in his lifetime. And of course, he originally supported the French Revolution until it got so terribly bloody. But he never fought in the American Revolution. It was his ideas that were revolutionary.
Right.
Some people say there were two revolutions. One was the war, and one was the revolution of ideology that happened after the war with the Constitution and the creation of a great democratic republic.
Now, some of the views are very, like I said, they're all very germane to what's going on today. But I liked the ongoing theme about service, heart, and integrity. And I think when a lot of us, and I'll be the first to admit, I have read a book or two on Thomas Jefferson. I, historically like to think I have a good idea. When I went to school in Rhode Island, I'm originally from New England. And the first 4 months was all American Revolution because they took us on field trips. We went to Bunker Hill. We went to all kinds of places. We're within a stone's throw of where I grew up. So we went to all of these amazing, we knew our Revolutionary War history great. And then we had 2 months to get from the revolution to Vietnam. So everything else was a little rushed. So I felt like I had a good foundation, and my dad was a politician, a local politician, and was also very much a fan of Thomas Jefferson. And, when I think about there's no such thing as an honest politician, about the concept of power and corruption. And I think one of the things that also was interesting was the astuteness of the language to the contemporary sense that was used.
Yes. That surprised me. He did use a lot of contemporary words in the sessions. I asked about that. And I don't think the medium was making them up. I think that I know he's very, very current with current events. He says that he walks the halls of Congress that once were sacred. And he's very, very disturbed by not just within the last administration or two, but over a long period of time,
sure,
by corruption, self-interest, and conformity. That was the first question I asked him. That was my question. What is your greatest concern about American government today? And his response was corruption, self-interest, and conformity, that the wealthy powers soon compromise the people who may go in with good intentions. Some people probably do go in to get rich, and they do. But even those who initially go in with good intentions very often will just get with the system and begin feathering their nests, as we all know. It's no secret.
I think there's a lot of candidates that some of us may recall from different areas, especially if you knew them on the local level, as they climb up through the candidates that I remember as congressmen, as governors, when they later ran for the presidential bids, they changed. And I think the machine, as it stands now, forces a change that is not good.
Yes, he says that basically. He said, as soon as you throw your hat in the ring, immediately in midair, it becomes infected. And he also said that it was like entering a thicket. Everywhere you turn, there are thorns, and there are things that stop you from doing what you want to do for the country, what you feel is right. And so he had so many negative. I have a pretty long chapter on the government, and that's my first chapter. I have other chapters on use of the military, foreign policy, the media, religion, slavery, race relations, higher education. I have a chapter on all of those things because all of those are important to him.
Well, I'm not sure if everyone is aware. I knew, but I'm not sure if everyone is aware that he founded the University of Virginia.
He did, yes. So it was important for me, being a Virginian, to ask him about that. So finally, he was saying so many negative things. I kept asking him, well, can't you say something positive? Can't you give us a little hope, or are we just all going to go down the tubes? And so I end every chapter. He does have something positive to say, that he does see that things will get better over time. And so finally, I asked him, I said, toward the end, I said, well, what would you do if you were in Congress, or what would you do if you were elected president right now? And he said that if he were elected president now, he could do very little, because he would not have enough of a following to to bring about the changes that he thought were important. That you can't be the lone ranger. You've got to have people with you. Right. So he said he'd probably start in Congress, and he stressed this concept. He said, you need to have a revolution in this country. but not the bloody sort. He said you need to have a revolution of integrity. And so he said that people in Congress should form, some of the newcomers and some of the better types should form circles of integrity. And he said that he would try to do that if he were in Congress. He would start in Congress first, not be president, and surround himself with people of integrity who would try to do the right thing and serve the people and not serve the big, wealthy special interests and not just feather their nests. And then he would encourage that the circle become wider and wider, and eventually out of that group, a president could emerge, either himself or someone else. All this, of course, is theoretical.
Sure.
But he said right now that is not happening, that there are a few people, he says he whispers in their ear and to remind them of their oaths that they took upon taking office.
If only they'd
But there's
listen.
not a very large circle of integrity right now. And so some of the reforms that he would want to make cannot be made right now.
And I think especially I'm gonna broaden it to the last 10 or 12 years have been alarming at best in a lot of those cases involving, elections, politicians, public opinion, reactions, rights, all of those important freedoms and things that we take for, as part of the machine have really decayed.
Yes.
And I think that no matter what side you're on, you can agree with that.
Right. Yeah, that was came out in our conversation about the media, that powerful interests, and we all know this, but powerful interests are trying to control the narrative, control the information that comes to the American people. And then he uses a modern concept, and this was surprising, but he knows about the internet, of course. He knows everything that's going on today. He's not just up there stuck in the 19th century, 1826, when he died. I used to think that, but I don't anymore. And so he said that what he craves most on this planet is critical thinking, that people not just swallow what they get, what's being fed to them from special interests, that they examine things critically and objectively, and that's not happening. And so he said that the one thing that's gotten out of control of the special interests is the internet. That was a modern term concept that he talked about. He said they tried to control it, but they can't. And he said eventually truth will out. Truth has a way of coming out one way or the other.
It does.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting to feel his personality emerge, and reading about him and reading his words were a very different experience. And I think that I felt like I got to know him.
Yes.
On a level that anything else had not done. And that must have been particularly fascinating for you.
Yes. He's very much the freedom fighter still. He fought for freedom from English tyranny. And he said, we got into slavery and all that. And he said that he had a narrow point of view, that his idea of freedom was mostly for white males at the time, but that eventually the freedoms that the founding fathers gave us would encompass more and more people. And he was very proud of that. So we talked about it. Yes, he's definitely a freedom fighter. Freedom, freedom, freedom. That's in every chapter. He harps on that. And that's where I think his true personality comes out. I consider myself a pretty decent writer. I wrote that first book, which is called Jefferson's Godfather. That's straight history, no metaphysical. And I used all material resources for that, letters and so on. But, even though I'm a pretty decent writer, I could never make up Jefferson's words that come out in this other book called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. And my mind is just not that creative. And so there are only three ways to look at the book. One is I wrote it, and I have the recordings that show that I'm the one asking the questions. and I'm not providing the answers. The
Right.
answers are coming through the medium, and they are being recorded. So I'm out. So the second way of looking at it is that the medium is making all this up as one big story. The medium is a very nice lady, but she majored in elementary education. She did not like history as a subject in school. She knew very little Jefferson history. She didn't know anything about his alleged slave mistress, Sally Hemings. She had to ask who that was. And we had a little session about that too, which was pretty interesting.
That got very interesting.
Yes. And so the third way of looking at it, if I didn't write it, if the medium didn't make it up, is that we are hearing from an entity claiming to be Thomas Jefferson from the other side. There's only three ways to look at it. But I say in the beginning of the book, you don't have to believe in mediumship to read this book and get something out of it, because the words have power, no matter who wrote them, whether I wrote them or they came from Jefferson or the medium. It's a very powerful book.
It truly is. And I think something that also was interesting is when you talk about his views, because it becomes almost like a bone of contention. He owned slaves, but he had this history with, it seems to, in some cases to be oppositional. And
yes.
And he was also a man, he was initially confined to his times. But I thought that was interesting that it at one point he enumerated that history sees him as a rebel, but he felt that he sacrificed a lot of his own opinions basically to keep the group cohesive. So he kind of didn't feel that he was acting individually as
That's
much.
right. That's right. Sally Hemings felt that he should have been more open about their relationship. And by the way, he did not cheat on his wife with Sally Hemings. His wife had died at an early age, and that came later. But he said that he was a man of his times, that he was brought up. There's no question about the hierarchical nature of things, that white males were at the top. And another thing that really surprised me, and this is what makes people think that I wrote Jefferson's words. He says a lot about the disempowerment of women as well as people of color, that women were not given credit for being intellectual equals with men. And so we get into that when I ask him about University of Virginia. And I said, well, what did you think about women and people of color being admitted there? And actually, a black male was admitted way before a white female was
Right.
in the undergraduate. And that was pretty typical of every formerly all-male college in America. So he said that it was a little easier for him to accept the concept of women, because they were, even though men were conditioned to think of them as intellectually inferior, but they did occupy the same space as the white males. And so that was a little easier. He said, in all honesty, he had to, even from his place in spirit, he still had carried those prejudices that he had been brought up with, and that he had to come to terms with the idea that he had no idea that his workers, and any of them could ever attend his college. It was just not anything that was in his realm of thinking or anybody else's at that time. And so he kind of apologizes that he was a person of his time, and he doesn't feel that way now from what he knows in spirit. And so I said, well, are you glad that people of color were admitted? He said, yes, I'm very glad. I'm very happy about that. But I had to come to terms with it. And he said, if I pat myself on my back, I have come to terms with that.
I think something also that, and a lot of, it's very difficult without getting the full picture of not just Thomas Jefferson, but anybody at the same time, that politicians at that time it was not a paid position. So yes, it wasn't lucrative to be in politics. Most had other, my beloved Sam Adams was also a brewer. Everybody had a day job, and,
right. Yeah, and Jefferson, excuse me,
no worries.
Washington was a very wealthy man, but outside of being president, was independently wealthy, married a wealthy woman, and he made wealth himself. He was able to free his slaves upon the death of his wife because he was wealthy. Jefferson was not wealthy. He was in huge debt when he died, and even if he'd wanted to sell to free his slaves, financially they were collateral for loans.
Sure.
It was very complicated back then, and also freed slaves. I'm not defending slavery.
Oh, certainly not.
Here.
No,
I'm just
no.
saying some reasons. But he also said, and this was something that surprised me. He said, and he had a lot of visitors up at Monticello, and he said he had to maintain a certain lifestyle as an ex-president, and he needed, basically, I'm kind of summarizing this, that he needed the slaves to maintain that lifestyle. It wasn't toward the end very lavish because he'd run out of money, but he did like to spend money on wine and books and so on. And he said he would have had to have left Monticello and gone to live in the country if he had freed his slaves. He said, unlike today, a president will leave that office wealthy.
Right.
But in our day, we didn't.
I thought it was also quite interesting that he voiced that he felt that the historians, to some degree, had rose-colored glasses. I loved that particular sentiment, that a lot of times they're looking back and they're making gods of men.
Yes.
And he was, in many sections of the book, speaks very eloquently of the fallibility of what he believed in, what he tried to do, what he didn't do, and how he feels. You could really get a sense of his hindsight.
Yes. He said that people later had made frozen icons of the founding fathers, that they were flesh and blood people. He said, we were all bastards, each in our own way.
There was something nice that is like, he had a very wry sense of humor.
Yes.
Yes,
he did.
I think I'll leave it to the readers to discover. I was particularly tickled by the views on the musical Hamilton.
Yes.
And that is something I think the readers would enjoy discovering as part of it. Did anything he say change your views? Did anything he say make you rethink something and change your views?
Well, I wasn't at all surprised about what he said about government, foreign policy, use of the military, the media. But as an historian, I had sort of thought the same story about his mother. I was surprised about what he said about his mother. That surprised me a lot.
So there's still a surprise. There's still surprises left.
Yes. We were led to believe that because he never wrote anything about his mother, that they were not close. And he said she had her problems, and today her problems would be treated. I think she had some mental health issues.
Sure.
But he said she gave him the greatest blessing, and that was the blessing of listening. He said she would drop everything when he had something to say, and she would lock eyes with him and she would listen. And he said, you have no idea how important that is to a child to be listened to. And that commentary came from the question, who is the most important person in your life? That came from one of the historians. And I was shocked by that, because I thought he'd say George Wythe, because I wrote about how important George Wythe was in his life in that first book, Jefferson's Godfather. He said, other than my mother. And then he went on to describe his mother's influence. I think that was unexpected.
Such an important sentiment.
Yeah.
I think in a day where I think we've all been out somewhere and we see small people with their parents, and the parents are focused on the phone or focused on, I think the idea of how important it is to be able to focus and listen. I think it gives them, in addition to the learning experience, I think it gives them a feeling of self-worth. And I
Yes.
think that's so eloquently stated in that thing. So spirit world, history, the metaphysical historian, is there going to be another book? Are you going to maybe perhaps choose another figure and do another book?
Well, somebody said, well, why don't you write about Abraham Lincoln or try to access Abraham Lincoln? And I said, well, I know a lot about the Civil War and I know a lot about Lincoln and I admire him, but the time period that I'm most interested in is the founding of this nation, not the war that tried to tear it apart. And I'm not the type of author who will grind out a book every year just to be doing that.
Sure.
I have to have a reason to write a book. And so I am writing another one, but this is just straight history. It's still about Jefferson and George Wythe, about how they established America's first leadership training school for future statesmen. Because we, aside from a handful, and I mean literally a handful of founding fathers, we did not have quality leadership in this country when we broke from England. And George Wythe, as America's first law professor at William and Mary, trained the first group of leaders after the founding.
What an amazing influence. That's
tremendous,
terrific. I'll be looking forward. I'm hooked. I'm gonna fangirl on you for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hooked. I love history. I feel very personally connected to history, which is funny because I thought it was wonderful that your family is an old Virginia family.
Yes.
The people that came from another country in my family, I knew personally. I'm only like first and second generation
right.
American. But having been party to seeing small town politics through the eyes of my dad, who was very passionate and very involved, and his parents were immigrants, it makes you proud to be part of some kind of process. We've all worked at polls in my family. We've all been part of the process and volunteered for our causes. And I think that it's what an incredible way, though, to connect to history, and to, I think Ben Franklin would be hilarious.
Yeah. Well, I guess I didn't finish answering your question about metaphysical history. I think there will be more books written, published, such as I have done, of famous figures, but anyone attempting to do that must have a trusted medium.
Yes.
And my medium is experienced, and she's well motivated. She's not going to make up anything, even if she has a certain political point of view that she might want to interject through Thomas Jefferson. I don't think she did that.
Didn't seem so.
Yeah. But you must have a really, really good medium, to have a good book. Mediums are like any other professional group. You've got some who are better than others. And I just happened to find a very good one who's very sincere. She's very, very sweet. And all she wants to do is help people. And she's not an historian, but she's very proud to have participated in this book.
As well she should be.
Yeah. And when she read the book, she said, wow, I don't remember any of that. Because it just came through her. And I don't think she even listens to the recordings, just comes through her. And then she goes on to the next thing.
That's wonderful. Again, the book is called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson by Suzanne Munson. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been a unique pleasure. The book was wonderful. I'm looking forward to reading more. And I really do hope that this becomes a more lauded area of writing, that we have more metaphysical historians that will go on to do that. So folks out there, find mediums, and good mediumship is key, as you said. And I think it would be a wonderful thing to see this expand and grow. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Rocky. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Macabre World. You can find us on the web at www.darkerartsstudio.com.